She let the magic within her flow. Her body changed, but not in the jagged, painful way Darius had forced upon himself. Her bones moved like water, her muscles realigning with effortless grace. She was human, then bear, then both at once. A creature of harmony, not chaos. She stepped forward. Aurora, still nestled against her, raised her small hands toward Darius' broken form, and sang. It was a sound older than language, older than war. A sound of remembrance, of what had been again. The air shivered around them, as if the world itself were listening. Darius staggered. The twisted magic inside him resisted, fought back. But the song was not something that could be fought. It did not attack. It welcomed. It invited. Margaret saw the moment he realized it. His snarling face twisted with rage, but beneath it, fear. Because this was a power he could not command. Could not steal. Could not own. Enough, he bellowed, his half-bare form convulsing as he raised a clawed hand. Dark energy crackled between his fingers, burning against the natural order. He would destroy them if he could not control them. Aurora's song rose higher. Margaret let out a deep, rumbling breath and joined her. Not in words, but in pure sound. A song of awakening, of memory, of balance restored. The green singers' voices blended with theirs, swelling into a crescendo that shattered the corrupted power around Darius. The darkness peeled away from him like dead bark stripped from a tree. His half-formed, stolen shape collapsed, his body writhing under the weight of magic that no longer obeyed him. He fell to his knees, clawing at his skin as fur receded, bones cracked, his human form barely holding together. And in his eyes, for the first time, Margaret saw recognition, not of power, but of loss. Of everything he had tried to twist and break, it had broken him instead. He let out a shuddering gasp, staring at his trembling hands. The magic was gone. Not stolen, not forced, simply refused. The grove would not accept him, because he had never sought to understand it. The pendant's glow dimmed, its purpose fulfilled. Aurora sighed softly, curling against Margaret's chest as if the battle had never happened. The green singers stepped forward, their shifting forms settling into something almost human. The balance has been restored, they sang, their voices filled with both sorrow and hope. Darius let out a strangled, bitter laugh. Then what happens now? He rasped. Margaret met his gaze. You live, she said simply. It was the worst punishment she could give him. To live with what he had done, to remember, to know. Darius let out a ragged breath, bowing his head in silent defeat. The storm was over. A new dawn. The grove breathed again. The roots unwound. The trees sighed in relief. The air was clean once more. Margaret turned toward Aurora, who watched her with eyes that were no longer just a child's. But something more. Something ancient and new, all at once. The last heir of Alder's throne. The bridge between human and bear, the child who had been trusted to a mother bear's care, had returned home. Margaret smiled, pressing a gentle kiss to Aurora's forehead. Come on, she whispered. Let's go home. The green singers watched as they left, their song shifting into something lighter. A song of beginnings, of a world where all life moved as one, of a future where no one would ever forget again. And somewhere, far in the deep woods, the bears sang too. The reckoning of Darius. Darius lay on the chamber floor, his breath ragged, his body trembling from the overwhelming force of true transformation. The green singers watched in silence, their forms shifting like ripples in water, as if waiting to see what choice he would make now that he had finally glimpsed the truth. Margaret Holden stood over him, still caught between forms, her silver-touched fur fading back into human skin as she regained control of her shifting. Aurora stirred in her arms, watching her uncle not with fear, but with something deeper. Recognition. Compassion. The battle was over. But the war between who Darius had been and who he now was had only just begun. The green singers stepped forward, their harmonic voices no longer filled with challenge, but with a kind of ancient sorrow. Now you see, they sang. Now you remember. But memory alone does not erase the choices that brought you here. Darius squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head. I thought I was saving us, he whispered, his voice hoarse. I thought, if I could burn it away, sever the connection, we could be free, stronger. We wouldn't have to live under the shadow of the past. He looked up at Margaret, something raw in his expression. But it was never a shadow, was it? She crouched beside him, keeping Aurora close, but her face held no hatred. No, she said simply. It was never a curse. You only made it one by trying to fight it. Darius let out a breath that shuddered through his entire body. I was wrong. His hands trembled as he looked at his own fingers, flesh that had twisted and broken so many times under his corrupted magic. Now, for the first time in years, his body felt whole, not stolen, not forced, just his. A sentence of the soul. The green singers stepped forward, their forms glowing with something like moonlight through deep leaves. You have broken many things. You have broken many things, blood denier. One of them said, its voice layered with 1,000 echoes. Some wounds can heal. Others will never fade. Darius let out a bitter laugh, pushing himself to his knees. So what happens now? He asked. Do you kill me? The chamber went still. Margaret looked at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, she shook her head. No, she said. You live. Darius blinked, as if he couldn't quite understand. Margaret rose to her full height, her voice steady and filled with the weight of something older than justice. You live with what you've done, with the choices you made, with the knowledge of everything you destroyed. She gestured toward the ruined tunnels behind them, toward the battle scars in the stone where Maven had given her final breath to hold him back. Darius flinched. Margaret stepped closer, lowering her voice. You remember now, Darius. That's your punishment. You will remember for the rest of your life. He swallowed hard. His body no longer rebelled against itself. But his soul? That was another story. The road ahead, the green singers turned to Margaret, their gazes full of something deeper than approval. The blood of two realms has been restored, they intoned. The path is open once more. Aurora's pendant flickered with light, as if responding to their words. Margaret held the baby close. She was no longer just a healer. She was a guardian, a bridge, a voice between the worlds that had forgotten each other. She turned back to Darius. He still knelt on the stone floor, staring at his hands as if he didn't quite know who he was anymore. The throne is still yours, she said, surprising even herself. Thaddeus growled low in his throat, but Margaret held up a hand. The people of Alder still need a leader. They need someone to help them remember. Darius let out a harsh laugh. You expect them to accept me after everything I've done? Margaret tilted her head. That's up to you. Darius was silent for a long time. Then, finally, he lowered his head. I will do what I can. It wasn't surrender, but it was a start. The dawn of a new age as the first light of morning seeped through the cracks in the tunnels. The green singers began to fade. Their song lingered in the air, woven into the very earth, a promise that the balance would hold, as long as those who carried the old blood chose to protect it. Margaret turned toward the passage that led back to the surface. Aurora slept soundly against her chest, her tiny form shifting in her dreams, caught between cub and child, as if she already understood the truth of what she was. Margaret took a deep breath, then stepped forward. She did not look back. Darius followed, his steps slow but certain, carrying the weight of his own redemption or ruin. and somewhere, in the deep woods beyond, the bears watched, singing softly to the rising sun. The redemption of Darius trembled as the magic flowed through him, not forcing, not breaking, but guiding. His body, once twisted by years of forced transformation, began to realign itself. Where before his shifts had been jagged, fractured, now they were smooth, effortless, a harmony rather than a war. The green singer's song pulsed through the chamber, carrying the scent of morning dew and the sound of leaves rustling in a soft breeze. It was not a song of battle or punishment. It was a song of remembering. Margaret Holden stood beside Thaddeus, watching as Darius struggled to embrace what had been stolen from him. Aurora cooed softly in her arms, shifting easily between bear cub and child, as if she had never known anything different. The glow of the pendant around her neck bathed them all in a soft light, not silver, not gold, but something older. Something older. Something from a time before names. Darius let out a breath that shuddered through his entire form. His eyes, once burning with a sickly yellow light, now shone with the deep, warm amber of the old blood. "I remember," he whispered, his voice filled with something fragile yet unbreakable. Margaret stepped forward cautiously, hated him, feared what he had become, and yet she could not deny the truth standing before her. The man who had led a purge against his own family, who had hunted his sister, who had nearly destroyed the legacy of transformation itself. He was kneeling now, looking at Aurora with the eyes of a man who had finally awoken from a nightmare. But awakening was not absolution. The cost of memory. The chamber hummed with waiting magic, the green singers watching but not interfering. Margaret studied Darius, the uncle who had once sought to erase every trace of what Aurora now represented. "Remembering does not erase what you've done," she said at last, her voice quiet, but firm. Darius flinched. "I know." His hands clenched at his sides. "I destroyed my own sister. I forced a lie onto an entire kingdom." His voice cracked, and for the first time he truly looked at Aurora, the child, his niece, his sister's last gift to the world. Margaret watched his face carefully, saw the warring emotions, guilt, grief, longing. Then, softly, Aurora reached toward him. Her tiny hand brushed his cheek, and Darius wept. Atonement or exile? The green singers began to shift again, their song growing fainter, as if giving them space for the decision that must now be made. Margaret turned to Thaddeus. "What happens now?" she asked. "He remembers, but that does not undo the damage." The great bear lowered his head in thought. "No," Thaddeus agreed. "But punishment is not for us to decide. The blood of 2 realms has already judged him. Now only he can determine his path." The air was thick with unspoken choices. Darius straightened, no longer trembling, no longer twisted by corruption. "I cannot undo what I have done," he said, his voice steady but raw. "But I will not let it end with me. Let me return to Alder. Let me fix what I broke." Margaret's jaw tightened. "And if I say no?" Darius met her gaze. There was no arrogance there, no entitlement. Only a man who had lived with hatred and fear for so long, he had nearly destroyed everything. "Then I will go into exile," he said simply, "and carry the truth with me, even if I have no kingdom left to give it to." Margaret inhaled sharply. This was it. The choice that would define not only Darius' fate, but the fate of all who carried the old blood. She turned to Thaddeus, then to the green singers, searching for guidance. But they said nothing. The decision was hers alone. The beginning of change. Margaret looked down at Aurora. The child who had been the spark for everything. She was the future. And if they truly wanted to honor the past, to restore the truth of what had been lost, they could not do so with vengeance. "You will return," Margaret said at last. "But not as a ruler," Darius stilled. Then as what? She held his gaze. As a witness. Darius' shoulders sagged, as if he had expected nothing more, but perhaps had dared to hope for nothing less. Margaret stepped past him and toward the tunnel that would lead them back to the surface. "You will tell the truth," she continued. "You will unbury the past you tried to erase. And if the people of Alder choose to accept you after that, then it will be by their will, not yours." Darius let out a breath that sounded too much like relief. "I swear it," he said. The green singers gave one final harmonious hum, a blessing, a warning. Then, as softly as morning mist, they vanished. The long road home, Margaret took the first step toward the tunnel's exit. Aurora stirred against her chest, but this time, she did not shift. She was human. She was bare. She was both and neither. Margaret understood now. She would always be both. As they emerged into the golden light of dawn, the forest seemed to exhale around them, as if releasing the breath it had been holding. Darius walked beside her, no longer twisted by corruption, but not yet whole. And ahead of them a kingdom waited. A kingdom built on a lie. A kingdom about to wake up. The battle for transformation. Margaret Holden steadied her breath as the green singer's song filled the chamber, harmonizing with the pulse of Aurora's pendant. The light spilling from the child cast shifting shadows across the cavern walls, illuminating images of transformation. The first bears learning to change, humans embracing their dual nature. But the glow was fleeting, flickering as if struggling against the dark presence pressing toward them. Beyond the tunnels, the enemy advanced. Hoofbeats thundered, the sharp scent of corrupted magic coiling through the air like smoke before a wildfire. And now, Darius' own past creations marched against them. Margaret turned to him, reading the turmoil in his face. This was the man who had designed the weapons meant to destroy them. "Tell us how to stop them," she said, voice firm but not unkind. Darius swallowed hard, his amber eyes reflecting both shame and resolve. "The dark steel is infused with magic meant to sever shifters from their forms," he admitted. "One touch will lock a being into whatever shape they're in when struck. Human, bear, or something in between." His jaw clenched. "If they manage to wound you, your transformation will be stolen forever." A shudder passed through the chamber. Even the green singers, eternal and wise, paused their dance. Thaddeus growled low, ears flattening. "A magic that denies choice is no magic at all. It is a curse upon the world." Margaret's grip on Aurora tightened. She could feel the baby's heart beating against her own, steady but insistent, as if the child knew this battle was as much hers as anyone else. "We have to fight them," Margaret said, turning toward the tunnel's mouth. "But not with their methods, not with their fear." Darius exhaled, his expression darkening with the weight of what he had once believed. "They won't show mercy." Margaret met his gaze without hesitation. "Then let us teach them something they've never known." The first strike. The chamber shuddered as the first wave of enemies breached the threshold. A dozen riders stormed into the cavern, their armor gleaming black, swords pulsing with dark enchantments. They were no ordinary soldiers. They were the last of Darius's elite hunters, those who had spent years perfecting the art of destroying transformation itself. But they had never faced true transformation. Margaret moved first. She did not shift into a beast. She did not become only a bear or only a woman. She became both. Her form flowed like water, her claws extending as her limbs retained their human agility. When the first soldier struck, expecting to cut through a beast's hide or a human's flesh, he met something that was neither, and both. Margaret ducked beneath the blade. Her movement, a dancer's grace, blended with an animal's raw power. Her hand, still partly human, gripped the wrist of her attacker, twisting. His corrupted steel clattered to the stone floor, the blade's dark glow fizzling as if the chamber itself refused to let it remain. Thaddeus followed, his massive form moving faster than seemed possible. He struck the ground with both forepaws, sending a tremor through the earth, unbalancing the riders. Darius, once their commander, now their undoing, moved with newfound ease, his shifts smooth, unforced. He wove between bear and human, fighting with the magic he had once tried to erase. Still, the weapons were deadly. One warrior managed to swipe at Margaret's side, the blade barely grazing her skin. Agony lanced through her. Cold and absolute, she staggered. For the first time, her shifting faltered. The steel was trying to lock her. Aurora's cry rang out, clear and sharp, not of fear but of defiance. The pendant flared with light, brighter than before, and the green singer's song rose in response. The glow washed over Margaret, burning away the cursed magic like sunlight melting frost. The moment she was free, she lunged, not in anger but in understanding. "You don't have to fight this way," she shouted to the soldier. "You don't have to be afraid of what you are," a few faltered. Some had once been shifters themselves, forced into permanent human form by Darius' old magic. Now, for the first time in years, they saw what true transformation could be. Now, the turning point, Darius' breath was ragged as he faced the last of his hunters. He recognized them all, men and women who had once trusted him. They were the ones who had believed his lies the longest. One of them, General Cedric, the man who had trained him in childhood, raised his sword. "You betrayed us," Cedric snarled. "You expect us to embrace the disease you spent your life trying to cure?" Darius inhaled sharply. This was his last test. Margaret watched him closely. Would he revert to force? Or would he prove that transformation was not just about changing form, but changing fate? Darius let his body shift, not into something monstrous, but into something free. He embraced the transformation, not as a weapon, but as a truth. And for the first time, he did not fight. He extended his hand. Not in violence, but in offering. "You've been lied to," he said. "We all have, but I remember now. Do you?" "Whoa." Cedric hesitated. The others around him wavered, and then, slowly, they began to lower their weapons. The end of the war, the Green Singer's song shifted into something new, something victorious. The cavern walls, once trembling with battle, settled. The corrupted weapons crumbled, their magic unable to stand against truth. Aurora's pendant dimmed, its work complete, and Darius, once the greatest enemy of transformation, stood before his former soldiers as proof that it was never something to be feared. "You are free to remember," Margaret whispered. And for the first time in generations, they did. The war was over, but the rebuilding had only just begun. The awakening of true transformation, the chamber pulsed with ancient energy, shifting between the overlapping seasons that had always marked its sacred space. But now, under Aurora's impossible glow, something new was happening. Something older than the Green Singer's song, older than the first bear who had dared to dream of another form. Margaret Holden felt it in her very bones. This was no ordinary transformation. The child in her arms was becoming something both familiar and completely beyond comprehension. Not just human, not just bear. Something before those words even existed. Aurora's light radiated outward, touching the cavern walls, seeping into the very air. Margaret gasped as she felt her own form respond. Her limbs elongated, reshaping, not just into bear or human, but something. She was flowing between shapes, not choosing between them. This was the first magic. The magic before shifters became locked into bear or human, before the divide between species was carved into history. And it had never truly been lost, only forgotten. A memory of the first change, the Green Singers recognized the moment for what it was. Their forms rippled into light, shifting into patterns that reflected Aurora's impossible shape. No longer bound by old divisions, they danced through all possibilities. Their song rose, filling the chamber with a melody Margaret could suddenly understand, not through words, but through feeling. It was a A time when transformation was not limited, when all life was one life. Darius staggered back, his amber eyes wide with awe. He could feel it too. His past lessons, the ones that had filled him with hatred and fear, crumbled in the face of this truth. "We were never meant to be separate," he whispered, his voice breaking. "They told us it was a curse to change, but the real curse was forgetting how to." Margaret met his gaze. He finally understood, but the enemy was still coming. The corruption approaches beyond the chamber. Dark magic twisted against the walls, trying to force its way into a place it had never been meant to reach. The soldiers drank their cursed potions, their bodies convulsing as their transformations were not welcomed, but forced. Twisted limbs, painful, unnatural shifts. They weren't becoming animals. They were becoming abominations. And through the stone, Margaret could feel their suffering. They had been taught that transformation was only a weapon, that it had to be dominated, torn from the flesh rather than called from the soul. That was their weakness. The choice before them, Aurora's light pulsed, her tiny body still shifting in the impossible dance between forms. Margaret knew what the Green Singers were asking without words. Would they fight fire with fire? Would they meet corruption with brute force? Or would they show these lost souls what transformation truly meant? Darius straightened, understanding the choice as well. Margaret saw something change in his stance. No longer the hesitant man caught between past and present. He was ready. "We show them," he said, his voice steady. "We teach them what transformation is supposed to be." Thaddeus rumbled approvingly. The Green Singer's song shifted, rising into something both beautiful and terrifying. And Margaret, holding the child who had awakened all of this, stepped forward to meet the enemy, not as a warrior, but as a teacher. The battle of the true and the twisted, the enemy burst into the chamber, their bodies broken by corrupted transformation. They roared, their voices twisted by the pain of their unnatural shifts. But instead of attacking, Margaret and the others did something no one expected. They changed, not into monstrous forms, not into weapons, but into true transformation. Their bodies flowed through the shapes of all life. They became bears, humans, wolves, birds. They moved like rivers, like wind through trees, like fire leaping through the night. And they welcomed the enemy to do the same. The twisted soldiers hesitate. Their instincts, the ones buried beneath years of hatred and fear, begged them to listen, because they could feel it. This was what transformation was supposed to be. A few of them staggered, their corrupted forms trembling. One dropped his cursed weapon, his body trying to remember how to shift naturally. And then another. But their commander, the last of Darius' old allies, roared in defiance. "They are deceiving you," he bellowed. "They seek to steal your power." He raised his sword, a blade made of dark steel, forged to sever transformation forever. Margaret saw the moment he realized his mistake, because Aurora was looking right at him. The child, still between all forms, tilted her head, her amber eyes ancient and knowing, and then, without fear, she reached toward him. The pendant flashed. For a single impossible heartbeat, the commander saw himself reflected in its light, and not as a monster, not as a soldier, but as a child running through the forests in another lifetime, before he had been told to fear transformation, before he had been made to forget. A broken sound escaped his throat. His sword clattered to the ground. The battle was over. The future of transformation. Margaret exhaled, shifting back into human form. Around her, the others did the same. Aurora's glow softened, the moment passing. The soldiers who had resisted, the ones who had fought against themselves for so long, stood trembling. Darius stepped forward. "You remember now, don't you?" Slowly, they nodded. Not all would change. Not all would unlearn their hatred. But the first step had been taken. And that was how the world would change. The first lesson, Margaret knelt, brushing her fingers against Aurora's cheek. The child blinked up at her, shifting effortlessly between bear and human. The first of the true shifters. The first of many to come. Margaret smiled softly. It's time to teach the world what transformation really means. The battle for transformation. The air in the chamber shimmered with tension, pulsing between the forces of remembrance and forgetting. Aurora, still shifting effortlessly through shapes beyond names, radiated a power that challenged the very fabric of existence. Her light pushed against the robed figures, the unchanging ones, who had spent centuries ensuring the old blood would stay sleeping. Their whispers slithered through the cavern, words woven in dark magic that made the walls tremble. The child must not awaken the old memories. The time of flowing forms must remain forgotten, order through separation, strength through singularity. The dream of unity must die. But Aurora's light only burned brighter. Margaret Holden, her own form shifting as smoothly as breath, felt the pull of the moment. This was not just a battle of magic. It was a war between truth and illusion, and the world would never be the same after today. The first strike, the unchanging ones moved as living shadows, twisting reality itself. Where they stepped, the chamber's shifting seasons froze. Flowers withered and became stone. The breath of autumn winds still. The flowing transitions of the green singers' dance faltered. Their magic sought to lock all things into permanent, fixed states. They didn't just fear transformation. They denied its very existence. Margaret's heart pounded. If they succeeded, nothing would ever shift again. Not bears to humans. Not humans to bears. Not the seasons. Not even the sky. Darius, his golden amber eyes burning with newfound understanding, snarled. They don't just want to stop us, he growled. They want to shatter the possibility of change itself. Thaddeus let out a low, rumbling growl, his massive form bristling with tension. They seek to rewrite the world in their image, one where transformation was never possible at all. A chill swept through Margaret. The implications were staggering. If they lost here, it wouldn't just mean the end of shifters. It would mean the end of time itself. Aurora's answer, the first unchanging one, raised a withered hand, a swirl of frozen magic forming in its palm. It lashed forward. A sickly white wave surged toward Aurora, seeking to bind her in one form forever. But before it could touch her, Aurora laughed. The sound was pure and clear, carrying the memory of when all things had been free. She reached toward the magic, not to fight it, but to transform it. Margaret watched in awe as Aurora's tiny fingers touched the oncoming spell. Instead of turning rigid, the magic melted. It flowed backward like a river, reversing its course, shifting colors from deathly white to the gold of dawn. It became something new. Something that had never existed before. The unchanging one recoiled, its form flickering. It let out a horrible, shuddering gasp. For the first time, it had felt what it was like to change. The turning tide, the green singers seized upon this revelation. Their dance resumed, faster now, a song of evolution, of movement, of endless possibility. Their forms rippled through the forgotten shapes of the world, showing visions of what had been before fear turned transformation into something to be controlled. Darius, no longer afraid, let himself shift with the song. He was a bear, then a man, then something in between. He let go of the rigid training that had once defined him and allowed his blood to remember. The first soldier, one of the men who had once served Darius, watched with wide eyes. Margaret saw something flicker in his gaze, hesitation, then curiosity, then recognition. Margaret stepped forward, her voice steady. "You don't have to fight this." The soldier trembled, looking at his hands, at the twisted corruption forced upon him by those who had lied. His body had been reshaped against its will, but now, he reached for something different. For a moment, his shape wavered. Then, with a cry, he let go. his form unfolded like a flower in sunlight, the corruption falling away as he shifted for the first time by choice. Another soldier saw this and did the same. Then another, and another. The battle was changing. The war was no longer between soldiers and rebels. It was between those who feared transformation and those who embraced it. The unraveling, the unchanging ones screamed. Their magic withered, unable to hold against the very force they had spent centuries trying to suppress. The world was remembering. The ancient lie, the one that had turned transformation into something feared, was breaking. Aurora stood at the center of it all, still shifting between forms, still glowing with the light of the first song. She raised one tiny hand, and the pendant flashed, not as a weapon, but as an invitation. A whisper moved through the chamber, carry on winds older than time. You can still change. The end of the old fear, one of the unchanging ones, hesitated. It turned its shadowed face toward Aurora, as if truly seeing her for the first time. Then, trembling, it reached out. The moment its fingers brushed Aurora's glow, its rigid form began to shift. Not violently, not through pain, through choice. Margaret held her breath. It had been so long, but they remembered. One by one, the unchanging ones fell. Not in battle, but in transformation. The last of them let out a shuddering sigh, their dark robes slipping away as they dissolved into something lighter, freer. Then, at last, they were gone. A new beginning, the chamber sighed in relief. The frozen air warmed. The seasons flowed again. Margaret, still holding Aurora, felt the very fabric of the world breathe. Darius exhaled. "It's over!" Thaddeus let out a deep, satisfied growl. Aurora cooed, shifting into a bear cub for just a moment before becoming a child again. Margaret smiled. "No," she said, looking at the world that was finally waking up. "It's just beginning." The last unchanging one. The chamber trembled with the weight of the battle between remembrance and forgetting, between the power of transformation and the rigid chains of stagnation. Where once the unchanging ones had ruled through the illusion of permanence, now their own forces crumbled beneath the truth. They had chosen their limitations. One by one, the shadows peeled away, revealing figures that had once danced between forms with grace and joy. But the leader of the unchanging ones remained. A being of pure darkness, it devoured light wherever it stood. Unlike the others, it did not waver, did not hesitate. Instead, its voice was like a blade against the air, sharp and absolute. "You understand nothing." The chamber's shifting seasons shuddered at its words. "We chose separation because unity was chaos. We chose single forms because infinite possibility was madness. The world needs boundaries, needs permanence." It lifted its hand, and the air thickened, as if time itself resisted movement. Margaret felt it press against her chest, against her bones. A power that sought to turn all transformation to dust. Then Aurora moved. The baby, still shifting between forms as naturally as the changing sky, reached toward the unchanging one. Her tiny fingers shimmered, no longer just human, no longer just bear, but something older. Something that had no name. And for the first time, the leader hesitated. The fear of change, the darkness around the figure shivered. For an instant, just an instant, Margaret thought she saw something else beneath the shadow. A shape that had once been fluid. A being that had once danced between forms, just as the others had. But unlike them, it had chosen to forget. Aurora's light touched the figure's outstretched hand, and in that moment the darkness flinched, not from pain, From memory, Margaret saw it all, the moment of the first separation. The instant when this being had looked upon transformation and recoiled, not because it was weak, but because it had been afraid. Afraid of the unknown. Afraid of the endless possibility of shifting, of flowing, of being more than one thing. It had feared losing itself, and in that fear, it had chosen to become nothing at all. The realization hit Margaret like a wave. It wasn't power that had driven the unchanging ones to seal transformation away. It was terror. They had feared what it meant to be limitless. The choice the leader of the unchanging ones recoiled, its form flickering, as though the truth had loosened something within it. Aurora's laughter echoed through the chamber, not in defiance. In indignation, Margaret saw the moment the figure understood. It could still choose to hold on to the illusion of separation, or to let go. For the first time in countless ages, the darkness wavered. Then, slowly, the figure reached back. Its hand met Aurora's, and the transformation began. The shadow did not shatter. It unraveled, like a storm breaking apart into the dawn, like ice melting under the first touch of spring. The unchanging one's form flickered, shifting between what it had once been, what it had become, and what it might yet be. Its voice, once an unyielding command, softened to something uncertain. "But who will I be?" Margaret's chest tightened. The question was not a challenge. It was a whisper of fear. The fear of every creature that had ever changed. The fear of stepping into the unknown. Aurora, small and infinite, bare and human and something beyond either, smiled. And in that moment, the leader of the unchanging ones let go. Its form broke apart, not into destruction, but into possibility. For the first time in ages, it was free. The end of the divide, the unchanging ones were no more. The last barrier between transformation and fear had fallen. The chamber sighed with relief, its seasons shifting freely once more, the walls humming with a song that had been waiting centuries to be heard. Thaddeus let out a slow, deep exhale. "It is done." Darius stood motionless, his eyes still locked on where the figure had stood. His hands clenched at his sides, not in rage, in grief. "They never had to be our enemies," he murmured. "No," Margaret agreed softly, "but they were too afraid to see it." She looked down at Aurora. The child blinked up at her, as if she had always known this moment would come. Margaret smiled. She whispered, "You reminded them." Aurora yawned, curling into Margaret's chest. And for the first time in history, the world breathed with her. A new era begins in the days that followed. The change spread. Across the realm, those who had feared transformation felt their blood remember. Where once shifting had been seen as a curse, it became a blessing once more. Nobles who had rejected their animal blood found themselves able to shift again. Old magics reawakened. The barriers between human and bear fell, and for the first time in 1,000 years, transformation was free. Margaret stood at the heart of it all, holding the child who had changed everything. Darius, once the kingdom's greatest enemy, stood beside her, no longer lost, no longer afraid. Thaddeus rumbled with quiet pride, and the green singers danced, because at long last, the world had remembered what it was meant to be. The return to infinite being as the last of the artificial separations dissolved, the chamber pulsed with a living energy that had been waiting since the beginning of time to be free. Margaret stood at the center of it all, Aurora cradled against her chest, the child's tiny form shifting between shapes with effortless joy. She was not choosing between forms, because there was no choice to be made. Every shape was simply another expression of the same eternal essence. The green singer's song surged, their voices weaving through the chamber like rivers joining into an unstoppable current. The very air trembled with the awakening of transformation, with the remembrance that all life had once danced between forms as easily as wind moved between trees. Darius fell to his knees, overwhelmed. His body no longer fought the changes. It flowed, shifting with the grace of something long denied, but never truly forgotten. He looked at his hands as they flickered between human and bear, between what he had been told to hate and what he now understood as his birthright. "This is what they feared," he whispered. Margaret turned to him, her golden amber eyes reflecting both human wisdom and bear instinct. "Yes," she said. "Not just the ability to change, but the understanding that we were never meant to be divided at all." The shattering of the false histories far above them, the royal city of Aldermere trembled. The changes that had begun deep in the ancient chamber rippled outward, through stone and root, through blood and memory. In the grand library, the very air crackled with an unseen force. The shelves, once lined with books that preached fear of transformation, groaned under a new weight, as if the truth had been waiting just beneath the surface. A young scholar, unaware of the ancient battle raging beneath the city, reached for one of the oldest tomes. As her fingers brushed the cover, the false histories dissolved into dust, revealing a much older text beneath. The pages shifted between human script and the elegant flowing glyphs of the bearkin. The scholar gasped. She had been taught that bears had never ruled, never shared their knowledge with humans. But here, before her, were records of the first pacts between their kind, stories of a time when shifting was not a curse, but a sacred gift. Throughout the city, carved stone bears stretched and yawned, their once frozen forms remembering movement. Statues that had stood for centuries changed shape before the eyes of stunned onlookers, their once fixed expressions shifting into knowing smiles. The throne of Aldermere, made from living wood that had once responded to the ruler's spirit, stirred. Its branches stretched toward the sky, blooming once more. The very heart of the kingdom was waking up. The true end of the war, Margaret felt it all. The shattering of lies, the crumbling of fear. The people of Aldermere, the villagers who had once cowered in terror at the idea of transformation, now felt their own blood stir. Children who had never known they could change let out startled laughter as fur and feathers and scales rippled across their skin. Elders who had long ago locked their abilities away out of shame felt the chains of forgetting finally lift. Even those who had once hunted the bearkin, who had feared what they did not understand, found their bodies shifting, because deep inside, the blood had always remembered. The false laws, the false histories, they had never erased the truth. They had only buried it. And now the earth itself was rejecting the lie. The power that Margaret, Darius, and Aurora had unleashed was not a war. It was a return. A return to what had always been. Darius, still kneeling, looked up at Margaret. His once haunted gaze was clear now. "What happens next?" he asked. Margaret looked down at Aurora, who stared up at her with the ancient wisdom of a child who had never forgotten. She smiled. "We teach them," she said. "We remind them." And above them, as the first light of dawn spilled over the newly awakened kingdom, the world remembered. The return of the true dance. The chamber pulsed with the energy of awakening. The green singer's song wove through the voices of the elemental dancers, binding together truths that had been locked away for centuries. Margaret held Aurora close, watching as the child continued her endless joyful shifting, between human and bear, between something older and something yet to come. The pendant's glow was no longer a beacon of crisis, but a gentle, pulsing reminder of a truth that had never died, only slept. Through the stone, the roots, the very bones of the earth, the news spread. "But so," in villages and cities, in forests and fields, the separation was dissolving. Bears stepped forward from the shadows, no longer hiding from the humans they had once shared their knowledge with. Children awoke to find their bodies shifting effortlessly, laughing with delight as they became birds, foxes, deer, whatever their souls had once been, whatever forms their ancestors had forgotten. The great cities stirred with memories locked away behind false histories, statues moving long-buried texts revealing the truth. And yet, with great power came a deep responsibility. Margaret felt it stir within her blood, a knowing, an understanding. This was not a return to chaos. It was a restoration of balance. She turned to the elemental dancers, beings of air and fire, of water and stone, their forms constantly shifting like the heartbeat of the universe itself. They had been here before the bears, before the first humans had learned how to shape themselves into something more, before fear had taken root. And they had waited. Now, their voices, as vast as the sky and as deep as the ocean, spoke in harmony with the green singer. The choice was never between stability and transformation, they sang, their words moving through Margaret's bones like wind through branches. It was between stagnation and conscious unity. Margaret's breath caught as she saw the truth within those words. Darius stepped forward, his form settling now, no longer the tortured, broken shape of someone caught between hatred and revelation, but one who had fully embraced the flow of change. His gaze, once filled with fear, now burned with understanding. The ones who locked us away. His voice was steady now, no longer fractured by doubt. They weren't trying to destroy transformation. They were trying to control it, to keep its power for themselves. The elemental dancers rippled in agreement. They feared the infinite choices. They sought to cage the dance of all forms, believing that if they could dictate which transformations were allowed, they would hold dominion over the world. The Green Singer's song shifted, showing glimpses of the past, not just of the false histories, but of those who had built them. Margaret saw it all in a rush of memory, not her own. The first rulers who had feared that unlimited transformation would lead to a world they could not control. The scholars who had rewritten history, who had planted fear in the hearts of the noble houses, convincing them that their shifting blood was an impurity, rather than their greatest gift. The war against the bears was never about eradicating them. It had always been about severing their connection to humanity, because together they had once been too powerful. Margaret staggered under the weight of it. It had never been about peace or stability. It had been about fear of unity. Fear of a world where power belonged not to the few, but to all. Aurora's choice. Aurora stretched out her tiny hands, her golden eyes seeing beyond time. The shadows that had once ruled transformation through control were broken. But the world stood at a threshold. With all that had been restored, what came next would be their choice. Margaret saw it, a future where all beings embraced transformation freely, where no one form was feared or locked away. But that future required something deeper, not just the restoration of memory, but the choice to step forward into something new. Aurora looked up at Margaret, and then she chose. Not with words, but with the glow of the pendant, with the way her form shifted into something neither human nor bear, but something more. Something fluid, something free. The choice was made, not just to restore what had been lost, but to go beyond it. To create a world where no shape was feared, where transformation was not a curse, but a celebration. And as the green singers and the elemental dancers raised their voices in one final triumphant note, the world outside trembled with the realization that it would never again forget. The age of separation had ended. The age of transformation had begun. The world exhaled, as if releasing centuries of tension. The green singers' dance wove through time itself, their shifting forms painting the air with memories of what had been and what could be. Margaret watched in awe as Aurora flowed between shapes effortlessly, her tiny laughter carrying the weight of an ancient truth, that all separation had been an illusion. From the forests and cities, beings of all kinds stirred with recognition. The bears who had once hidden in shadows stepped forward, no longer feared. Children, untouched by old prejudices, shifted between forms without hesitation, their bodies remembering what their ancestors had forgotten. Darius stood at the threshold, no longer a man divided by fear and control. His form settled, not locked, but balanced, embracing both his human blood and the wild power that had once been his birthright. The pendant pulsed one last time, not as a beacon of change, but as a quiet promise. The age of forgetting had ended, not through battle, not through conquest, but through a single child's laughter, reminding the world that transformation had never been a curse, but the purest expression of life itself. The lesson of transformation in our modern world. The story of Margaret Holden, Aurora, and the Green Singers is a tale of transformation, not just of bodies, but of minds, beliefs, and the very fabric of existence. It speaks of a world where the fear of change led to separation, and where power was built on the illusion that fixed identities were safer than fluid ones. In many ways, this is not just a fantasy. It is a reflection of the struggles we face in modern society. Today, we live in a world that often fears change. People cling to rigid identities, whether cultural, political, or personal, because they believe stability comes from defining clear boundaries. But history has shown us that true strength lies in adaptability. Just as Aurora and Margaret rediscovered the ancient truth that transformation is natural, we too must recognize that growth, both personal and societal, requires embracing change rather than resisting it. Think of how technology has reshaped the world. Once people feared the internet, believing it would disrupt traditional ways of communication. Yet today it connects us in ways that were once unimaginable, breaking down barriers between nations, languages, and cultures. Those who resisted it found themselves left behind, while those who adapted found new opportunities. This mirrors Darius' transformation in the story. He clung to old beliefs until he saw with his own eyes that what he feared was not weakness, but an evolution of strength. The lesson applies to personal growth as well. Many people struggle with change in their own lives, whether it is a career shift, personal identity, or moving to a new phase of life. Fear tells us to stay the same, to resist uncertainty, but transformation is the essence of being human. Just as Margaret learned to embrace her dual nature, we too must learn that growth does not mean losing who we are, but expanding into who we are meant to be. Even on a global scale, this story teaches us about the importance of unity. The greatest challenges of our time, climate change, inequality, and division, cannot be solved by rigid thinking. They require us to remember that we are all connected. Like the world in the story, our planet thrives when we stop seeing differences as threats, and instead recognize them as part of a greater harmonious whole. Aurora's laughter, the final symbol of true transformation, is a reminder that joy exists in the act of embracing possibility. The world does not have to be a place of fear and restriction. If we, like the characters in the story, choose to remember rather than forget, we can create a society that does not fear difference but celebrates it. A society that flows like water, adapting, growing, and thriving in the endless dance of existence. In the end, transformation is not just about change. It is about remembering who we have always been: one humanity, one life, in infinite forms. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If this story moved you, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more inspiring stories of resilience, hope, and the unbreakable spirit of life. See you in the next story.